Cool. So let's talk about the 4 major ways that cells communicate. So these are the 4 major ways. So the first one is going to be direct communication. That's cell-to-cell communication. They're going to be attached through gap junctions. And through those gap junctions, that's when you have things like, for instance, calcium ions being able to transmit from cell to cell. And that's going to moderate all sorts of things, for instance, like muscle contractility, right? Especially in like your cardiac myocytes, there's going to be a ton of gap junctions in those Z discs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those, but those are going to be the region where you find a lot of desmosomes connecting those myocytes tightly together. And you also have gap junctions, which are literally just passageways where you can have ions passing from cell to cell. The other way that you're going to see cells communicating is through paracrine function. The reason why I highlighted para is because that root word, para, is going to mean adjacent to, para. So think like para-umbilical, I don't know, I can't really think about any other good examples. But if you see para, you're going to think something adjacent. So you're talking about cells that are going to be in close proximity to one another within the same tissue type. Okay? So that's going to be paracrine function. Endocrine communication is going to be a little bit different. It's like paracrine communication. However, you're going to be releasing hormones directly into the blood system. And because it's going into the blood, it's going to be entering throughout the entire circulatory system in the body. Okay? So for instance, you can get T3, T4 getting released by your thyroid gland. It's going directly into the blood system, and that thyroid hormone is going to go throughout the entire body to do different types of physiological functions. All right? And then the last one is going to be synaptic communication, and that's going to be involving neurological tissues. We're not really going to go too far into that today because we're talking endocrine system. We're not really going to be going too deep into neuroanatomy, but there are neurotransmitters that are going to be released at the presynaptic junction. So you have the presynaptic release of neurotransmitters that are going to have different types of physiological effects, depending on what the target organ is. So here's a summary of all that. So you have, number 1, direct communication. You're thinking cells that are going to be directly associated with each other, right? So it's going to be all through gap junctions. Paracrine, it's going to be cells that are adjacent to each other within the same tissue type. Endocrine function is going to be your glands releasing hormones directly into the bloodstream, and then you have synaptic communication through neurotransmitters. So here is a good summary of some of the different major glands that we're going to be talking about. Eventually, we're going to cover all the different glands, all the different hormones that they release, and all their target tissues, and what the physiological reaction is going to be to the release of those hormones. So to begin with the hypothalamus is sort of the regulator of the pituitary. The hypothalamus is going to release a lot of different releasing hormones, like for instance CRH, so cortisol releasing hormone. And then once cortisol releasing hormone gets released from the hypothalamus, it's going to activate the pituitary gland to thereby release other hormones. So like ACTH, for instance, adenocorticotropic hormone. And then once that gets released from the pituitary, in the same case as ACTH, that is going to be arriving at the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are going to thereby release cortisol. That's like the final target. So that's more of like a complex hormonal system that's involving multiple different organs throughout the entire body to result in a final physiological response, such as the release of cortisol. So pituitary gland, that's going to be considered the quote-unquote master gland of the body. That's like the ultimate gland that releases a lot of different hormones that are responsible for many different things. So let's take the examples that are up there. So we talked about ACTH, which is adenocorticotropin hormone, right? So that's going to help to release cortisol from the adrenal cortex. TSH, that's thyroid stimulating hormone. That's actually going to be a result of thyroid releasing hormone. So thyroid releasing hormone gets released from the hypothalamus. Thyroid stimulating hormone gets released from the pituitary gland, and then thyroid stimulating hormone is going to release, is going to help the thyroid gland release T3 and T4, which are your major thyroid hormones. And then GH is growth hormone. PRL is prolactin-releasing hormone, prolactin, which allows for lactation. FSH and LH, so that's follicle-stimulating hormone versus luteinizing hormone. Those are going to be involved in like sex hormone release. And then MSH is melanocyte releasing hormone. So that's going to release melanin. So that's going to be sent off to the cells in your epithelial layer to release pigmentation, effectively. And then oxytocin and ADH. ADH is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone basically prevents the body from losing fluids. Okay? And that's going to be released from the posterior pituitary. All those other ones that I mentioned, those are all going to be the anterior pituitary, i.e. the adenohypophysis. Adeno just means glandular. The back of the pituitary, the posterior, is going to be the neurohypophysis. And the neurohypophysis is going to release two major hormones. One is going to be oxytocin, and the other one is going to be antidiuretic hormone. Do you guys know what oxytocin does? If you were to like summarize oxytocin in one word, what would it be? Huh? Happy. Love. It's kind of like the love hormone. So oxytocin is released in pair bonding. When a child cries, mom actually releases oxytocin from her brain. It sort of like allows for greater amounts of pair bonding. Antidiuretic hormone, it's going to be released when in times when you're trying to conserve water, right? So if you're dehydrated, if you don't have enough water in your system, then your posterior pituitary is going to start releasing antidiuretic hormone to maintain osmotic pressure. Pineal gland, that's going to be melatonin. There's also another hormone that's released by the pineal gland, but we don't really go into it in this class. But dimethyltryptamine is another hormone that's released by the pineal gland. So that's going to be involved in like sleep-wake cycle, things like that. But melatonin also going to be involved in sleep-wake cycle, right? That's why you take melatonin, so you can try to kick your circadian rhythm into gear so you can fall asleep. So that's going to be moderated by the pineal gland. The parathyroid gland, PTH, it's going to allow for the release of calcium. So it's going to allow for the absorption of calcium. Also, it's going to be involved in releasing calcium from bones. And then heart, there's going to be two major hormones involved in the heart. So one's atrial natriuretic peptide. So atrial, because it's going to be derived from the atrium of the heart, right? You have four chambers, two left and right atrium, and then you have the ventricles as well. So in your atrium, you see atrial natriuretic peptide. What that does is if you have too much pressure in your circulatory system, right, your blood pressure is too high, as the name implies, natri, when you see that like natriemia, something like that, that's going to involve sodium, right? So natriuretic, so sodium, and then uretic, urinating. So what that does, it excretes a greater amount of sodium so that you can bring the blood pressure down, right? So that's what ANP does. And then BNP, brain natriuretic peptide, does something very similar. Do you think BNP is mostly found in the brain, though? I gave you a hint in the bottom of the slide there. So BNP was actually first discovered in pigs. Okay, so it was discovered in pig brains. Later on, it was actually found out that BNP is mostly going to be associated with the ventricles of the heart. So whereas ANP is associated with the atria, BNP in reality should be renamed VNP because it's associated with the ventricles, but whatever. The name stuck. But it does the same thing. Basically, it allows for the excretion of sodium so that you can bring down the person's blood pressure. Any questions on that so far? Cool. And then let's go over some of these other major organs that are going to be associated with the endocrine system. So we talked about T3 and T4. Those are going to be your thyroid hormones. T4 is thyroxine. That's the active form of thyroid hormone. And then you have triiodothyronine, which is going to be T3, which eventually gets converted into T4 to become active. Calcitonin. What calcitonin does, if you have too much calcium, remember we talked about PTH, which is parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone, if your calcium levels are low, PTH is going to get activated so you can increase your calcium levels. So it's involved in calcium resorption from bones, calcium absorption in your GI. Calcitonin does the exact opposite. Calcitonin says, oh shoot, you have way too much calcium, let's bring the calcium level down. So I like to think of calcitonin as like maintaining the tone of calcium in your body. And then let's get into suprarenal glands. I really hate the way that this textbook labels those. Nobody in the medical field calls those suprarenal glands. Those are adrenal glands. Same thing, but nobody calls it suprarenal. So adrenal glands are going to be involved in a lot of different hormone activity. The adrenal medulla, you guys familiar with like fight and flight, right? So that's going to be moderated by epinephrine, norepinephrine. That's going to be associated with your adrenal medulla gland. And then when you get into the adrenal cortex, there's going to be 3 different layers in your adrenal cortex. And then those 3 different layers are going to be involved in sex, stress, and salt. So sex hormones, like, let me think about a couple off the top of my head. Sorry, I had a brain fart. So sex hormones, stress hormones like cortisol, and salt, so like aldosterone. So aldosterone allows for controlling of salt in the body. Then you get into kidneys. The kidneys are going to be associated with erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is going to be activated as soon as you have your low red blood cells. So if you're anemic, then you're going to have a greater amount of erythropoietin release so that you can increase the production of red blood cells. That's going to be moderated by the kidneys. Adipose tissue. This one's kind of interesting. We don't really think about adipose tissue so much as like having a function other than just, like providing like cushion around the kidneys or just like storage of energy. But adipose is actually involved in controlling appetite. There's 2 major hormones that control appetite. There's going to be leptin, and it's not listed up here, but ghrelin is the opposite of leptin. What leptin does, it's kind of like a satiety hormone. That means, oh, I just ate a lot of food, I have enough energy, I don't need to eat anymore. And so leptin gets activated, says, yo, dude, maybe put down the cheeseburger, you ate enough. On the other side, you have ghrelin. And ghrelin is going to be produced by the stomach. And when ghrelin gets released, I like to think of it as like your stomach going grr, right? You got like a rumbling stomach. That means you're hungry. So ghrelin is going to be sort of like the balancing act between leptin. So you have leptin released by your lipid cells, ghrelin going to be released by your stomach. And then your pancreatic endocrine function in your islets of Langerhans, you have 2 major hormones. You have insulin and glucagon. So insulin is going to be released when you have too much glucose in your circulatory system. So it allows for the absorption of glucose or the bringing in of glucose into cells so that they can be used for glycolysis. And then you have the opposite, glucagon. Glucagon is released when glucose is gone. Okay? So when you have no glucose, then glucagon gets released so you can undergo gluconeogenesis. So those are going to be kind of like the balancing act between the 2. And then we're going to get into that quite a bit when we start talking about like diabetes, for instance. Right? So when your beta islet cells no longer function properly, that's going to be associated with which one? Diabetes 1 or 2? You guys know off the top of your head? Which one is the most hereditary of the 2 types of diabetes? There's a hereditary component to both, but there's one that has more of a hereditary component. Type 1, yeah, exactly. So people are usually born with type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, you can also have some hereditary components to it, but it's mostly going to be acquired, right? It's mostly acquired through eating really bad unprocessed foods, too much sugar in the diet, etc. Basically, you're exhausting your ability for the cells to recognize insulin. So it's like insulin intolerance. Whereas type 1 diabetes, you just don't produce insulin because those beta islet cells are no longer functioning. And then sex hormones. So you got androgens, and then we got estrogens, progesterone, etc. So that's going to be moderated by the gonads. And we're going to get into sexual reproduction ad nauseum at the very end of the semester. I think it's like the last 2 weeks of this class. So we're going to go into that a lot more detail later on. So these are the things that hormones are mostly engaged in. So hormones are really important. If we didn't have hormones, there's a lot of things that we wouldn't be able to do. Hormones allow us to develop, right? So for instance, what's a really important hormone in the developing fetus? Can you guys think of one off the top of your head? Have you guys ever heard of cretinism? So cretinism, do you guys know what cretinism is from? When you don't have enough thyroid hormone. So if you don't have enough thyroid hormone It usually happens in like developing countries that don't have ionized salt. If you don't have iodine in your diet, your thyroid gland is not going to be able to produce thyroid hormone. And so in those places that don't really have access to ionized salt, something that we take for granted here, you see a greater degree of cretinism. Right? So you get like things like mental deficiency and other abnormal development because of a lack of thyroid hormone for the developing fetus. So it's important for development, it's important for growth. Which one we talked about earlier, which is like the most important one for growth? It's in the name of the hormone. Growth hormone, exactly. So there's growth hormone, that's going to be one of the major ones associated with growth, also associated with things like acromegaly, gigantism, right? So that big dude that I showed you in the beginning of the lecture, he probably had a lot more growth hormone than most of us in this class, probably more than all of us combined. And then reproduction. Obviously, we talked about the sex hormones. Those are going to be heavily implicated in all different areas of reproduction. And then maintaining homeostasis, right? So we talked about calcium already quite a bit. You want to make sure that you don't have hypercalcemia or hypocalcemia, right? So you want to make sure you maintain a good balance of calcium, because calcium is going to be involved in all sorts of different functions, not just developing bones, right, but also for muscle contractility, things like that. So calcium actually acts as a second messenger. So you need to make sure that you maintain calcium levels, and that's what calcitonin does, as well as parathyroid hormone. Blood volume. We talked about antidiuretic hormone. That's going to be something that's moderated, that moderates blood volume, right? So if you have an increased level of ADH in your body, that means you're not going to be excreting as much urine, right? So you increase your fluid level in your body. And then we talked about how for the endocrine system is going to be where you see release of hormones directly into the bloodstream, right? So it's going to be a little bit different than paracrine communication. Endocrine is going to be directly in the bloodstream, so you're going to have hormones basically interacting with all sorts of different organs in your body. And then in terms of free versus bound hormones, hormones can just be hanging out freely. They usually have a much shorter lifespan if they free float in the bloodstream. If they're free-floating hormones, they're going to be broken down by both the liver as well as the kidneys. Usually when things get metabolized, it's either one of the two. It's usually through the liver or the kidneys. And so free-floating hormones are only going to last about an hour or so in your body before they get metabolized. Whereas bound hormones are going to be bound to different carrier proteins, right? So those carrier proteins are going to actually increase and prolong the lifespan of the hormone in your body. Okay, so make sure you know the difference between those two. And we kind of already went over all these different organs in the endocrine system. I mean, that basically almost covers the entire body, right? So what organ system can you see right off the top of your head that's not listed on here? Lungs? Yeah? What about neuronal tissue? So you have glands in your brain, but for instance, the spinal cord, not really listed on here, so not really much going on in terms of endocrine function. You do get neurotransmitter release, but that's going to be different than the endocrine system. So long story short, you see the endocrine system is going to be associated with almost the entire body, almost every organ system. So let's talk about the difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system, both of which are going to be involved in communication to one degree or another, right? The main difference is that the nervous system is going to be mostly using electrical signaling, right? So you have action potentials are what are going to dictate the ability for one neuron to communicate with another neuron downstream, right? Or if it's communicating at the neuromuscular junction for muscle contractility. So that's going to be the major difference. And with the nervous system, there's going to be specific targets, kind of similar to the endocrine system as well, but a little bit more specific because the axons are going to be directly associated with a specific dendrite or at the neuromuscular junction, a specific muscle. And then the endocrine system is going to be using hormones, right? Instead of ions to allow for action potentials or neurotransmitters, we're we're going to be seeing hormones in the endocrine system. And then for the endocrine system, you do see a lot more cells being affected by those hormones, right? So you can see a downstream cascade effect with the endocrine system versus the nervous system. You have like one target, and that's basically it. Oh yeah, and then the endocrine system is going to be a lot slower. So think about like growth hormone. That's going to be a very slow process of development. Thyroid hormone and the developing fetus is going to be a very long, drawn-out process. Cool. We basically already covered all that. So you have neurotransmitters associated with neurological communication versus hormones that get carried through the bloodstream that are going to be attaching to different receptor proteins on whatever target or effector cell that they're going to be associated with. Okay. All right, let's talk about upregulation versus downregulation. So this is how your body is able to control the amount of hormones in your system. So if you have way too much of something in your body, let's use drugs as an example. Drugs is a pretty good way to conceptualize this. Let's talk about opioids, right? We're sort of in the midst of an opioid epidemic. I think last year we had about 107,000 people died of opioid overdose. That's like record-breaking. Mostly like deaths of despair, so people with like depression, other types of comorbidities. What happens when you take opioids? Maybe fentanyl, maybe like heroin, something like that. You're going to be introducing your body to an opioid, right? And those opioids are going to be attaching themselves to an opioid receptor. The most common one is the mu receptor. The mu receptor is mostly associated with things like euphoria, like dullness of pain, things like that. So people that are chronic opioid users, what happens when a person uses opioids too often, besides dying, potentially? What's up? Yeah, so what happens when they get used to it? What's that mean? Huh? They become like desensitized to the drug, right? So that's like the whole process of developing an addiction, right? When you develop an addiction, all of a sudden you become desensitized. What happens when you become desensitized to a drug? What do you think happens at the cellular level? Let's talk about the receptors. What happens to those receptors? Huh? What? Blocked off? No, that would be if you took like naltrexone or naloxone. That's usually what you use to block those receptors if somebody's ODing, right? What happens to those receptors? They're not getting blocked, per se. You can block them artificially using drugs, but... Huh? Sort of. So she said they start slowing down. Kind of. They don't start slowing down, per se. They're not getting produced as much. So in other words, they're getting downregulated. Because your body's like, oh my God, there's way too many opioids in the system. We don't need this much activity. So in other words, the effector cells start downregulating the production of the opioid receptors. Okay? So that's a very similar thing that you're going to see with hormones as well. You can see a downregulation of hormone receptors or an upregulation of hormone receptors depending on how much of the hormone is actually in the system. Back to opioids, just because I like to digress a lot. What's one of the common reasons why somebody overdoses on an opioid? There's multiple different reasons, but talking about receptors, let's take a guess as to why that might be the case. Yes? That is totally part of it. So the patient develops tolerance to the drug, right? So with that tolerance, that means you downregulate the receptor. Then what happens? Maybe they go clean, maybe they go to rehab, or maybe they get arrested and go to jail, which happened to one of my favorite guys, Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. He went to jail for like 40 or 50 days. He got clean. Then he goes back to the streets, gets released from jail. He shoots up heroin. He uses his regular dose. But his cells now upregulated those receptors, and now he got flooded with too much opioids, and that's what killed him. And that's often what kills a lot of patients that relapse on those kinds of drugs, is because all of a sudden they want to do the drug again, and then they go back to using the exact same quantity that they used to use prior, right? And so that's usually the kind of like the deadly cocktail. Other things that kill people too are going to be like the combination of the drugs with each other, like combining an opioid with alcohol or something like that. So you get like respiratory suppression. But anyways, that's a huge digression. But it's a good way to conceptualize hormones because hormones do exactly the same thing. As a matter of fact, opioids kind of act as a hormone as well, depending on the circumstance. So you have downregulation versus upregulation. When you have downregulation of a receptor, that means you're going to become less sensitive, right? So you can just think of it as being down, less, less sensitive, downregulation. Upregulation is going to be the opposite. You become more and more sensitive to whatever hormone or compound you're introducing to the body or that the body is producing. So let's talk about specific body condition. I don't know, maybe say calcium levels. Maybe calcium levels are really high. And so the gland, calcium levels are too high. Okay, cool. Let's start releasing calcitonin. Right? So you start releasing calcitonin from the thyroid gland. And then you start, that's going to be the hormone releasing calcitonin. And then you have lower calcium now because of that. But then all of a sudden you have too low calcium. You need to increase your calcium levels. And then what's going to happen? The gland's going to get activated, your parathyroid gland. And then you're going to get a release of PTH, parathyroid hormone. That's the hormone. And then you're going to get an increase in the level of calcium. So it's just a never-ending cycle of just a balance, right? And that's how we develop, or how we maintain homeostasis. Here's another really good example. This is involving the thyroid gland, right? So if you had, let's see, here's a thyroid gland producing thyroid hormone. If you have way too much thyroid hormone being produced in your thyroid gland, those are not only going to have negative feedback on the hypothalamus, but it's also going to have negative feedback on the pituitary gland as well. Then the opposite is true. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone, T3, T4, then it's going to have a positive feedback on your hypothalamus as well as your pituitary gland to try to start stimulating the production of thyroid hormone. So pretty straightforward stuff. It's kind of like a thermostat, right? It was hot as hell in here. I tried to turn the thermostat down. It didn't let me. But if I did turn the thermostat down, I would bring it down to 50 degrees. And then once it gets down to 50 degrees, then the thermostat would turn off, right? So it's kind of the same thing, right? So it's like a negative, positive feedback loop. We already went over this, the different types of communication, but these are the major types that we're going to talk about when it comes to endocrine communication: direct, paracrine, endocrine. Direct communication, just to recap, you'll see a lot of this in your cardiac tissue, your muscular tissue. So in your cardiac myocytes, you have these little intercalated discs. And in those intercalated discs is where you find not only desmosomes, which help to keep those cells tightly bound together, you also have gap junctions. And those gap junctions are going to be channels through which you can get different ions, mostly calcium. Calcium is going to be involved in cardiac myocyte contractility. And then with paracrine function, prostaglandins is a good example of that. Prostaglandins are involved in a lot of different things: inflammation, pain, uterine contractility, things like that. We're going to talk a lot about those later on this semester. And then we already talked about endocrine function ad nauseum. The way these hormones are going to work, they have to have receptors, right? So a hormone can get released into the bloodstream. If you don't have any receptors for that hormone, it's not going to do anything. It's kind of similar to viruses. You guys take microbiology yet? Any of you guys? Okay, well, when you get into microbiology, viruses are very similar. Viruses have like little spike proteins, and those spike proteins need to find a receptor for them to gain entry into the cell. So influenza is a great example. Influenza requires receptors on the epithelial layer of your respiratory system in order to enter into those epithelial cells. Same thing with hormones. Hormones are going to require a specific receptor. So they act sort of like a lock and key. So that's why I included that image in the top there with a nice little pretty lock and key. So you need to have, so here's your cell releasing hormones, okay? And you have a cell hanging out over there. It's got receptors on it. Turns out that those are the correct receptors for the hormone, so it's going to actually be able to activate that target cell. And you have other cells as well in your body, but maybe they don't have cell receptors, hormone receptors, so they're not going to actually be able to get activated by that hormone. So you can flood that cell as much as you want with that hormone, and the cell is not going to have any sort of effect whatsoever. So it has to be very specific, lock and key. Sorry about the sound effects. All right, so these are some different types of hormones. So we're going to talk about these different classes. So there's three major classes of hormones. You have amino acid-derived hormones. The major derivatives of amino acid hormones are going to be tyrosine and tryptophan. Tyrosine is going to be associated with the development of thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, and it's also going to be involved in dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. And that cascade is actually how it happens. You start with the precursor, tyrosine, and then from the precursor, you're able to develop, depending on the enzymes that are present, you're able to start creating and developing different types of hormones or neurotransmitters. So like dopamine, for instance, neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine, epinephrine, neurotransmitters. Those are going to be released during things like fight and flight, right? Norepinephrine, epinephrine, that's involved in like sympathetic activation. Dopamine is going to be involved in the dopaminergic reward system, right? So like you get an A on exam 1, you get a flood of dopamine, right? That's going to be part of like that reward system. So it kind of encourages you to keep on doing good things. And then tryptophan is going to be the other major derivative for those amino acid type hormones. And tryptophan is going to be coming from things like chocolate, turkey, milk, also red wine. Lots of fermented foods are going to be very high in tryptophan. And note the cascade. It goes tryptophan, then it goes serotonin, and then it goes melatonin. Okay? So think about last year on Thanksgiving, you ate, a giant turkey, and all of a sudden you started getting kind of a food coma. That's going to be associated with the tryptophan, which eventually turns into melatonin. And melatonin is what moderates your sleep-wake cycle or your circadian rhythm. Okay, so if you flood yourself with these things, you're going to start creating more serotonin as well as melatonin. That's also why eating a gratuitous amounts of chocolate makes you happy. It's because all of a sudden you start producing more serotonin. And serotonin is going to be associated with mood regulation, mood stability, things like that. I also included in the bottom right here 5-HTP. That's 5-hydroxytryptophan. You can buy this over the counter. Some people who are on antidepressants like SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, sometimes instead of taking SSRIs, they'll take 5-HTP. 5-HTP is sort of like a more natural alternative to SSRIs. And what 5-HTP does, it's 5-hydroxytryptophan, it's a precursor to serotonin. So if you take 5-HTP, what you're allowing your body to do is to naturally synthesize serotonin. Okay, so that can be a mood stabilizer. I tried it before. It works pretty well, sort of. Anyways, and then peptide hormones. Those are going to be mostly insulin and glucose. By the way, I'm going to show you what the difference between amino acids versus peptides versus proteins. They're all kind of lumped up in the same category. They're just different subcategories of protein derivatives. And then lipid derivatives. So anything that's going to be water insoluble, that's going to be originating from cholesterol, these are going to have cholesterol precursors. So these are going to be things like sex hormones, so steroids, androgens, cortisol, and then your eicosanoids, which are going to be your prostaglandins and leukotrienes. Leukotrienes are going to be associated with your leukocytes. So they kind of activate and recruit leukocytes to undergo inflammatory process to fight off things like infection, etc. So that image on the right, that's I included that so you can kind of conceptualize the difference between amino acid versus peptide versus a protein. So you guys probably taken some basic. Have you guys taken basic genetics yet? No? Basic biology at all? Anyone in here take 181? A little bit? Okay, so we have a couple students that took 181. So When you're undergoing transcription and translation, that's where you're going from DNA to RNA to proteins, right? You have a bunch of amino acids, and all those amino acids, when they combine in different patterns and conformations, that's when you have different types of peptides being produced. And a peptide is basically just a chain of amino acids. And then the way in which those peptides fold in on each other, that's when you get we call it a tertiary structure. So the tertiary structure is the actual functional structure of a protein. And that's going to be dictated by peptides. So peptides fold in together. They have like disulfide bonds, hydrogen bonds, all sorts of different types of bonds. So they form like a nice three-dimensional structure, and that's going to be the actual protein. So when we talk about amino acids and peptide hormones, amino acids are just going to be singular bits of what would make up a protein. And a peptide hormone, like insulin and glucagon, those are going to be chains of amino acids. And then when we get into steroid hormones, those are going to be lipids, right? So those are all fats. When they say that cholesterol is bad, right, we're mostly talking about LDL. HDL, which is like the healthy cholesterol. LDL, they call it like the lethal cholesterol. HDL is going to be really important in a diet. But that's how you get a lot of these these cholesterol-derived hormones. You get it from mostly your HDL. So you want to make sure you have fat in your diet because it's going to be important. Not too much, in moderation. All right, so we briefly talked about free versus bound hormones. With free hormones, just know that the most important thing about that is going to be the duration of time that the hormone is going to remain in your body. Eventually, that hormone is going to be degraded through enzymatic degradation, or it's going to become metabolized. And it's mostly going to be metabolized by the liver or the kidneys. And then you have your bound hormones. A lot of your hormones are going to be bound. So one great example is thyroid hormones. You actually have steroids that are also going to be bound, right? So thyroid can actually exist longer in your system, thyroid hormone, because it's going to be bound to thyroid-binding globulin, and then things like testosterone, androgens, those are going to be bound through sex hormone-binding globulins. So those are going to be binding proteins that allow for those hormones to remain longer in circulation. So free hormones, think 1 hour. That's kind of like like a good safe spot. So if it's in the system for less than 1 hour, you know that was a free hormone. If it was longer than an hour, then you know that the hormone was bound. Okay, we already talked about that. Now let's talk about lipid versus water-soluble hormones. We already talked a little bit about cholesterol, right? So cholesterol is going to be falling into those lipid-soluble hormones, right? Because it's derived from lipids. Some good examples are going to be estrogen, androgens, cortisol. So cortisol, the stress hormone, that's going to also be a lipid-based hormone. And then thyroid hormones are also going to be lipid-based. So T3 and T4. And then your water-soluble hormones, there's a lot of them. Good examples are going to be growth hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, prolactin, etc. Now, the big difference between lipid-soluble and water-soluble. If you have something that's lipid-soluble, is that going to easily cross over the phospholipid bilayer of your cell membrane? What's like the major composition of the phospholipid bilayer in your cell membrane? Huh? Yeah, lipids. Phospholipids, you have phosphorus heads, you got the lipid tails. Do you think something that's lipid soluble will cross over the phospholipid bilayer? Yeah, it will. So lipid soluble hormones actually just freely enter into the cell, whereas water soluble are going to be repelled. Right? That's like the major way that your cell remains has its structural integrity. You have that phospholipid bilayer, it keeps all the cytosol within the cell, right? Then you have like extracellular fluid outside of the cell. So it keeps the structural integrity. And it's all because of like water and lipid interaction, right? So the water gets repelled from the lipids, and lipids are going to able to free flow through that lipid bilayer. So in other words, your lipid-soluble hormones, think about sex hormones like estrogen, testosterone, things like that, those are going to freely enter into the cell. And once they enter into the cell, they're going to undergo different enzymatic functions activating genes. So they're going to activate genes within the nucleus to allow for transcription of RNA and then translation of that RNA into proteins. So that's what those lipid-soluble hormones do. So they allow for activation of genes, things like that. So regulation of genes. That's like the major function. Water-soluble hormones don't do that. They don't just enter into the cell. They can't. So in other words, they're going to be acting sort of as ligands. You guys ever heard that term, ligand? It's a fancy word for like lock and key, right? So those water-soluble hormones, they're going to require a receptor that they attach to, and they're going to act as a primary messenger. Once they attach to that receptor, then they activate secondary messengers, which activates a further cascade inside the cell. So it allows for amplification of signals within the cell. So that's what water-soluble hormones do. And then so the second messengers, one of the major ones is going to be CAMP. That's cyclic AMP. You guys know what AMP stands for? You guys heard of ATP from the powerhouse of the cell? ATP, adenosine triphosphate. AMP is adenosine monophosphate. So cyclic AMP is going to be one of those secondary messengers. It's derived from ATP. Cyclic GMP is another one that's cyclic guanosine monophosphate. And then calcium ions can also be secondary messengers as well, especially in like cardiac type tissues. So let's talk about how thyroid hormone would work as a lipid-soluble hormone. So you have over here, let's see here. So here's steroid hormones on the left side. On the right side is thyroid hormones. So let's look at steroid hormones real quick. So we don't know which one this is. It could be estrogen, it could be testosterone, some type of androgen. So you have this hormone diffusing freely across that phospholipid bilayer, right? So it enters into the cytosol. Once it's inside the cytosol, it could bind itself into a receptor found within the cell. Once it binds, then it can enter into the nucleus, right? The nucleus is where you find the bulk of your genetic information, right? That's where your DNA is. And once that hormone enters into the nucleus, you can get activation or deactivation of different types of genes in that on the DNA, okay? And then once you get activation, for instance, you start maybe transcribing RNA, right? And then RNA is going to go back into the cytosol so that you can undergo translation of different types of proteins. Now, thyroid, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Thyroid hormone is actually going to be activating the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. So it's going to be entering into the cell just through diffusion, right? And then it binds itself to mitochondria. And once it binds to mitochondria, then it's going to start activating the production of more ATP, because that's where you get the bulk of your ATP, right? That's part of your aerobic cellular respiration. So if you had a patient that had hyperthyroidism, what would happen to that patient if they had like way too much thyroid hormone? What would they feel like? What would they be acting like? What would they look like? Huh? They would what? Stiff? No. I don't think they would be stiff. No, they wouldn't be stiff. What would they be doing? What does the thyroid do? What's thyroid hormone do? Huh? Oh, they might get a goiter. Yeah, they might get a goiter. If they had like something like Graves' disease, they might get a goiter. But I'm talking on like the signs and symptoms. So like symptoms, not the signs. Oh, that'd be the opposite. So if they had too much thyroid, they would actually look skinny. They would lose weight, right? That's because you have activation of mitochondria, you have activation and release of ATP. All of a sudden, the person's feeling really energetic, and they start getting anxious. They start getting anxiety. They start getting weight loss because their metabolic rate goes really high. They might also start getting like sweats, diaphoresis. They get temperature intolerance. They might be sitting in this room feeling really warm, like I do. So I might have a thyroid issue. Hypothyroid, if they have too little thyroid, they have reduction of this kind of activation, right? So in other words, people who are hypothyroid, they tend to be lethargic, they're a little tired, they gain weight, right? They might have increased appetite. Oh, sorry, I take that back. They might have like kind of decreased appetite. Hyperthyroid, it's kind of different. Like you might see a little bit of a appetite implication, but not so much. You mostly see like kind of like their metabolic rate is kind of slower when they're hypothyroid. Temperature, they get temperature intolerant, but in the opposite direction. They feel cold. They feel like, they might feel like it's way too cold in here. So you might see them wearing like a jacket or maybe like a scarf around their neck when it's kind of inappropriate to do so. So that's lipid-soluble hormones. So kind of basic stuff. I included this image here just to kind of show you the kinds of things that can enter into a cell just through diffusion versus things that are going to require like a transport protein or probably like a, maybe like a gap junction of some sort. So things that are able to enter freely, gases, because they're so tiny, so oxygen, carbon dioxide, can freely diffuse across a phospholipid bilayer, no issue. Benzene rings, because they're nonpolar, right? So they're going to be able to enter freely into the cell. Benzene rings are actually going to be components of a lot of our solvents. That's why certain types of solvents can be potentially carcinogenic, because if a benzene ring gets into your cell, it can actually interfere with your DNA, cause damage, and potentially cause carcinomas. And then things that are charged molecules are going to be repelled, and then water is also going to be repelled too. Actually, no, sorry, water crosses freely, depending on the circumstances. But things that are charged molecules are going to be repelled. And then large molecules like hormones, they're not going to be able to cross the lipid bilayer if they're water insoluble. So let's move on. Let's see here. So let's talk a little bit about second messengers. So second messengers are going to be associated with your water-soluble hormones, right? So lipid-soluble, you don't need a second messenger. It's going to go directly into the cell. It's going to activate, different receptors, or it's going to engage with DNA to either activate the DNA or deactivate certain signals in the DNA. Whereas with water-soluble, you're going to see second messenger activation. The major one is going to be cyclic AMP, cyclic GMP as well. And then once you get activation of cyclic AMP, so you have the hormone, that's going to act as the primary messenger, right? So it's going to act as a primary messenger or ligand if you want to use that terminology. Then you're going to have a G protein activation. Once G protein gets activated, that's when you have adenylate cyclase, which turns ATP, right, adenosine triphosphate, it turns that into AMP. And then it becomes cyclic AMP because of adenylate cyclase. And then after that happens, you get all sorts of downstream cascade effects. Different cells will have different types of effects. So let's talk about these ones over here, epinephrine and norepinephrine. This is going to be happening for those different hormones. That's going to be happening in your adrenal medulla, right? So you're going to have this type of downstream activation in your adrenal medulla, and that's going to be able to activate epinephrine, norepinephrine. And then for this guy over here, same thing, epinephrine, norepinephrine. You can have both of those acting as first messengers. Sorry, let me take that back. I think I kind of misinterpreted this. The epinephrine and norepinephrine would be considered the first primary messenger. So that'd be the first primary messenger that would actually activate different cell types. So these ones, we're talking about beta cells. Sorry, scratch that last bit that I mentioned about the adrenal medulla. Once the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, then the epinephrine and norepinephrine can act as a primary messenger. Once the epinephrine and norepinephrine attaches to the receptor on, for instance, beta receptors, those are going to be found in your heart as well as your lungs. So beta-1 receptors, let's talk about the heart. So if you have epinephrine, for instance, attaching to beta-1 receptors in the heart, that's going to increase heart rate, right? So that's going to be part of your sympathetic activity. That's part of that fight and flight, right? So you're activating the heart. You can get in your beta-2 receptors in your lungs, if you have adrenaline, norepinephrine, then you're going to get activation, or you're going to have bronchodilation, so you can breathe more rapidly. So you can get better oxygen perfusion. And then for alpha receptors on this side over here, those alpha receptors are going to be found on your vessels. So when you have activation of alpha receptors with epinephrine, norepinephrine, you're going to have vasoconstriction. Okay? So let's recap with the water-soluble hormones. So this is an overview. So all these are going to be water-soluble. Prolactin, which allows for lactation. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to thereby stimulate the release of cortisol. Growth hormone, ADH, oxytocin. So these are all going to be water-soluble hormones. So they're all going to require, in other words, they're all going to require specific receptors to allow for secondary messenger activation. All right, so here's an example of what another example of what secondary activation could look like. So you have your G protein receptor getting activated, then you have ATP turning into cyclic AMP, and then you have a bunch of different downstream effects. So we're going to talk about what amplification looks like in a second here. But long story short, you have that primary messenger activating those secondary messengers. And those secondary messengers will thereby further activate a downstream cascade of different effects. So we kind of talked about alpha-1 was vasoconstriction, right? Another example was the beta-1, beta-2 receptor. So beta-1 found in your heart, which is going to increase cardiac contractility, heart rate. And then beta-2 would increase bronchodilation in the bronchioles in your lungs so that you can breathe better or breathe with more facility. And then oxytocin is another example of water-soluble. So oxytocin, during childbirth, you're going to have uterine contractions, and that's going to be moderated through oxytocin release. So let's talk about amplification. So with amplification, you can have a very small amount of hormone that results in a really, really large signal as a downstream effect, right? That's kind of the beauty of hormones. Hormones can result in, just a little bit of a hormone is necessary to result in a really large effect. So here's a couple examples. So this chart on the right is a good example. You start with one hormone of epinephrine, okay? So that's going to be part of your fight, flight, right? Sympathetic activity. Then you have all these different G protein activations that are happening downstream to that. And over here, you have the number of activated molecules. And you can see it 10 to the 2, 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4, 10 to the 6, all the way to 10 to the 8. 10 to the 8 is 100 million products from that one single epinephrine molecule. So it's pretty impressive the amount of downstream amplification that you can get from a small amount of hormone. So in other words, these hormones are very powerful. Here's another image of what that looks like. You have all the different types of activation from G protein activation, adenylate cyclase, cyclic AMP, and then activation of different protein kinases, and that's going to increase all of the secondary messenger signal through amplification. So we'll watch a little video on all that. Hopefully it's not too loud.
Consists of hormone-producing tissues located throughout the body. The circulating hormones control the rates of body processes and maintain homeostasis. Within an endocrine gland, endocrine cells secrete hormones, which diffuse into nearby capillaries. The cardiovascular system transports these hormones throughout the body, affecting target cells in various tissues. Target cells for a specific hormone have receptors that bind the unique three-dimensional shape of that hormone. Cells that lack a specific hormone receptor are unresponsive to that hormone, even if a high concentration of the hormone is present around the cells. Although cells express a variety of receptors, we'll focus on one particular class, receptors that bind water-soluble hormones and exert their effects through the intracellular second messenger, cyclic AMP. These receptors are embedded in the cell's plasma membrane because water-soluble hormones cannot enter the target cell directly. A hormone molecule, acting as the first messenger, binds to its receptor, causing the receptor to change shape. The receptor can now activate specific intracellular G proteins. The activation process begins with the release of a GDP molecule from the G protein in exchange for a GTP molecule. This causes the G protein to change shape and become active. The hormone-bound receptor activates many individual G proteins, which greatly amplifies the signal from a single hormone molecule. An activated G protein the plasma membrane until it binds to and activates the enzyme adenylate cyclase. Once active, adenylate cyclase converts ATP to the second messenger, cyclic AMP.
All right, are you guys getting bored to death by that video? Because I definitely am. All right, let's move on before anybody starts falling asleep in here. And then we're going to do some quizzes, questions in a little bit so we can wrap up. We got 15 minutes left. So I'll do another couple of minutes here, and then we'll move on to the quizzes, questions, so I can get attendance and see where you guys are at, see if you guys are paying attention. We already talked about that. We already talked about that. Let's see here. We talked about that. So let's talk about a couple different reflexes. So you see reflexes in like the endocrine system, similar to what you see in the neurological system, right? So if you did like a patella reflex, it's kind of a similar concept, but different mechanisms. So you can have hormonal stimuli that can be affected by changes in, for instance, like the composition of your blood, or even maybe like the amount of blood pressure, right? So that's where you see things like antidiuretic hormone, ADH, things like that. And then you can also see neuronal stimuli, which is going to be involving neurotransmitters and different neuroglandular junctions. So we're talking about like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and the adrenal medulla. So let me move forward here. So this is a summary of what that looks like here. So the humoral stimulus, whether it's like the composition of your blood or like the pressure in your blood, a good example is going to be calcium. We already talked about parathyroid hormone as being involved in increasing your levels of calcium. That's one good example. Neural stimulation, that could be involved in like the adrenal medulla, releasing epinephrine, norepinephrine. And then also hormonal stimulus, so different kind of effects being a result of, for instance, like pituitary activation. So let's wrap up with this, simple versus complex endocrine reaction. So with simple reactions, we're talking about just one single individual hormone being involved. So heart, we talked about ANP versus BNP, right? So atrial natriuretic peptide versus brain natriuretic peptide, which allows for the excretion of sodium from the kidneys. Pancreas, insulin, and glucagon, those are just one single hormone that just does one basic thing, right? Versus a more complex system. So more complex systems, we're thinking mostly the hypothalamus pituitary axis. So you have the hypothalamus in your brain, which can activate the pituitary, which is also in your brain, which can thereby activate different parts of your body, whether it's your thyroid hormone or your adrenals. So those are going to be more of like a multiple organ type process. And it's going to involve more than one hormone. So that's going to be what you see with the HPO axis. So here's an example of a simple endocrine response. So if you have like way too much glucose in your body, all of a sudden your pancreas says, you need to start releasing insulin. And then once you have insulin released, then your body can, or your cells can start absorbing glucose into the cells so that the glucose can become processed. And then for other hormone release involving the HPO axis, you have your primary control center, which is going to be your hypothalamus. Then you have your master gland, the pituitary gland, and then you have different target organs, whether it's the thyroid gland or like the adrenals. Okay? So pretty straightforward stuff. So let's go ahead and wrap up with quizzes. You guys done quizzes before, right? Okay, cool. So you can either use your phone or your laptop. So hopefully I can log in without any issues. All right, go ahead and join. And it is 4:09, so we'll go all the way to the end of class. If we don't get through all the questions, we'll continue those questions next time we meet. And by the way, the way that I structure these quizzes questions, they're highly reflective of what you guys are going to see on your test. Okay, so this is a good way for you to assess yourself. I'll include the links in the announcements so you guys can use that to help you study for the exam. What's up? I am, yeah. So I make edits. So whenever I get the final draft, I'll definitely post the final draft to the announcements. Yeah, I know that you guys like to take notes on the PowerPoint, so I apologize, but you know. Oh yeah, and by the way, make sure that you're signing on with your name as it is in Halo, because I'm doing this for attendance purposes. I don't want like just Sarah. There's like probably 4 Sarahs in here, so make sure you do first and last name, please. It'll make Saludia's life a lot easier. So if my count was correct, we have 53 of us. So we got 4 more people need to log in. I'll give you 1 more minute. If you can't log in, come up and put your name on a piece of paper for me, okay? So I know that you were here. Cool. All right, we're going to go ahead and start. If no one was able to log in, or someone was not able to log in, just keep me posted, okay? Write your name on a piece of paper. Good. Most of you guys got that right. That's great. Yeah, let's get out of here. So glucagon. What does glucagon do? When does that get released? It's kind of in the name. When glucose is gone. Okay. So glucagon gets released when you have a very low amount of glucose in your body. What's glycogen? Is glycogen a hormone? Huh? I heard some S's. You guys say storage? It's like storage. It's like a way to store. It's like a storage molecule. So you get glycogen, you get storage in your muscle as well as your liver. You got different. It's like a highly branched way to store, energy molecules, basically. Insulin was the correct answer. That's what's released when you are maintaining your blood sugar. I think that was an easy one. Looks like most of you guys got this one correct, which is good. All right. No explanation necessary. Let's go to the next one. Good job. make these shorter. Wow, good, excellent. You guys got it correct. Good for you. Let's move on to the next one. Maybe I'm going a little bit too easy on you guys. I think I'm going to have to make your test harder. If you see like both, X and Y as an option, is that always going to be the correct answer? No, right? It wasn't this case though. Don't be fooled. So if you do have way too much T3, T4, you're going to have both negative feedback on the pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. Okay? Which question was this? That was one of the examples of when the both B and C would be incorrect. So you wouldn't see increased production of the hormone because when you're talking about endocrine system, you're talking about bloodstream, right? So you're getting a gland that releases the hormone into the bloodstream, right? So it's not going, if the target cell is not receiving the hormone, you're not going to see that type of reaction of actually like creating more of the hormone. So you would see more of upregulation of the receptor, okay, in the target cell, because the target cell is not the one producing the hormone. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Well, it looks like the majority of you got it correct, but so just know that the target cell is not going to be actually involved in the production of the hormone itself. It's mostly going to be involved in the production and regulation of its own receptors for that hormone. Okay? We have two more minutes, so I think we can get through this. All right. Looks like all of you guys got this correct, which is great. Good. Excellent. Yeah, the thymus is definitely involved in the endocrine system, adrenals, adrenal cortex, and the medulla. The stomach as well. The stomach releases ghrelin, gastrin, pepsin, things like that. Spinal cord is not directly involved. All right, last but not least. You guys get it right or what? Oh, man. So, okay, direct communication. Cells directly associated with each other, cardiac myocytes, gap junctions, okay? When you're talking about cell-to-cell communication with a single tissue, you're thinking more paracrine. So not direct communication, it's going to be paracrine, meaning it's going to be adjacent cells within a single tissue. I know it's kind of confusing. Just make sure you're familiar with the way the definition is laid out in my lecture notes, and that would help you with that question. Okay, guys? Otherwise, have a great day, and I will see you all on Thursday.